What would you do if a flight attendant looked your 8-year-old daughter in the eye and decided she didn't deserve a simple glass of water? Now imagine you're not just any passenger, you're the silent owner of the entire airline. This isn't just a story about poor service. It's a story about a moment at 35,000 feet that peeled back the layers of power, prejudice, and silent strength. A father in a quiet suit, a daughter with big dreams and braided hair, a flight that started like any other until one voice, one refusal, and one cruel glance changed everything. Why did the flight attendant target the little girl? Why did no one stop her at first? And what happens when the man she dismissed finally stands up, not with rage, but with grace and resolve? This is a journey you'll never forget, one that will make you question, who do we overlook every day, and what happens when they finally speak? If this kind of story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Buckle up, we're about to take off. The early morning light crept softly through the large bay windows of the Denver International Airport terminal, painting the polished floor tiles in warm gold. Most passengers moved with sleepy efficiency, dragging rolling bags, clutching coffee cups, heads down, eyes scanning departure screens. For most, it was just another travel day. Julian Everett didn't stand out in any way. Dressed in dark slacks, a fitted navy sweater over a collared shirt, and a worn leather messenger bag slung across his shoulder, he could easily pass for any thoughtful professional heading to an early meeting, but a closer look revealed quiet strength in his presence, calm, composed, with the kind of stillness that didn't need to announce itself. Beside him skipped his 9-year-old daughter, Alana, her bright sneakers lighting up with each step. Her small backpack had dangling keychains shaped like stars and a tiny globe. She clutched a notebook tightly to her chest, a sketchbook filled with airplanes and clouds she'd drawn from memory. Her tightly coiled hair was styled into 2 puff ponytails, each wrapped with yellow ribbon bows she'd insisted on tying herself. They were booked on Crescent Pacific Air Flight 184 bound for Boston, a midweek journey on a mid-sized Airbus A321. To the outside world, it was just a father-daughter trip, but in reality, the man in the navy sweater wasn't just any traveler, he was the principal owner and CEO of the very airline he was flying on. Julian preferred to fly anonymously. No first-class upgrades, no corporate entourage, no red carpet. It wasn't out of vanity, but principle. Since taking over Crescent Pacific 3 years ago, he'd made it his mission to lead from the passenger seat, not just the boardroom. "Daddy," Alana whispered, tugging on his sleeve as they made their way through TSA. "Do you think they'll have apple juice on the plane? I'm sure they will." He smiled, checking their boarding passes. "But if they don't, we'll get some after we land." She nodded thoughtfully, as though weighing the pros and cons. Then her eyes lit up as they passed a bookstore with an airplane coloring book in the display window. Julian paused with her, crouching to meet her height. "We have a long flight. You want it?" She grinned, nodding enthusiastically. Moments later, they were seated at their gate. Alana, engrossed in her new book, legs swinging under the seat. Julian watched her silently. In her, he saw wonder unclouded by cynicism, curiosity untouched by fear. He wondered how long he could protect that part of her in a world that sometimes didn't know what to do with black girls who smiled too brightly or asked too many questions. Final boarding call for Crescent Pacific Flight 184 to Boston. "All passengers please proceed to Gate 32. Julian stood, helping Alana into her jacket, then picked up both bags. He often let her go first in line, encouraging her to show her pass to the gate agent herself. It was her little adventure. At the boarding gate stood a crew of attendants in pristine uniforms. A tall woman with silver-streaked hair and a tight bun stood at the front of the line. Her name tag read Eloise Granger. Her posture was sharp, almost military-like, and her eyes scanned each passenger with a practiced precision. Alana smiled up at her and offered a soft, "Good morning." Eloise didn't smile. She simply nodded once and looked past the girl to scan the next boarding pass. Julian caught the moment. He felt it, a small, almost imperceptible sting, one he was used to brushing aside. He placed a hand on Alana's back and gently guided her forward. Inside the aircraft. The aisle bustled with passengers finding seats. Julian had booked 2 seats in the mid-cabin section, row 18A and B, window and middle. He had specifically chosen economy, wanting Alana to know normalcy, not insulation. Power was something to be wielded with intention, not indulgence. As they stowed their bags, another attendant greeted them with a warm smile. "Good morning, folks. Let me know if you need help with anything," he said cheerfully. His badge read Connor Diaz. "Thank you," Julian replied, offering a polite nod. Alana beamed. "I like your wings." Connor grinned. I earned these by being the fastest coffee pourer in the skies." She giggled, and Julian relaxed a little. Moments like these were the reason he still believed in people. Even in systems built on hierarchy and tension, individual acts of kindness shone through. As they buckled in, Julian handed Alana the window shade cord. "You're in charge of the skies now." She pulled it open just as the sun peeked over the mountains, sending streaks of orange and pink across the horizon. "Best seat on the plane," she whispered. Julian smiled, but something lingered in his mind, the cold flick of Eloise's eyes and the way they slid past Alana as though she weren't there. Maybe it meant nothing, or maybe it meant everything. He looked out the window with her. The wheels would leave the ground soon, and with them, so would something else, something unspoken, something simmering, something no one saw coming. The cabin air had that unmistakable scent, recycled oxygen, faint hints of brewed coffee, and the clean sharpness of upholstery recently sanitized. It was the scent of departures, of business trips and reunions, of quiet goodbyes and hopeful landings for Julian Everett. It was also the scent of oversight, the invisible pulse of an operation he had spent years trying to humanize. Passengers filed in, dragging carry-ons, juggling phones, adjusting jackets. Overhead bins slammed open and shut like percussion. Julian and Alana were already seated, quietly settled, watching the world pass down the aisle. "Dad," Alana whispered, her eyes following a woman with a tiny dog poking its head from a backpack. "Is that allowed?" Julian chuckled. "Service animals. Some people need their pets close when they fly." She nodded, eyebrows raised with curiosity. "That dog looks like it runs a company." Julian grinned and leaned in. "Looks like it runs my company." She giggled, the sound a soft bell above the hum of boarding chaos. A few rows ahead, Eloise Granger stood straight-backed at the forward galley. She was organizing beverage carts with robotic efficiency, her mouth in a fixed neutral line. Her movements were practiced, too practiced. There was no warmth in her rhythm, no natural flow, just click, pull, straighten, click, pull, straighten. Julian had seen the type before. High-functioning, senior crew, excellent records, rarely written up, yet they sometimes carried a certain brittleness, one that cracked under the pressure of basic human compassion. As the final passengers boarded, Eloise made her way down the aisle, checking seat numbers, occasionally pointing wordlessly when someone appeared lost. When she reached row 18, she glanced at Julian and Alana, then immediately looked away. No smile, no nod, not even the performative welcome aboard. Julian caught it again, noticed it, not just what she did, but what she deliberately didn't. He kept his expression neutral. He wasn't here to make noise. Not yet. Behind Eloise, Connor Diaz weaved through the aisle with a passenger manifest tucked under his arm. He offered to help a flustered older man lift a heavy bag into the overhead bin and earned a grateful thank you. As he passed Julian's row, he gave Alana a small wink. "You two okay over here?" Julian nodded. "We're good." "Thanks, Connor." Connor smiled and continued on. Julian appreciated the balance. Not everyone on board needed to shine to make a flight successful, but when someone didn't even try to extend the most basic kindness to a child, it stuck out like turbulence on a clear day. The cabin door closed with a hydraulic hiss. A chime sounded. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came through the speaker, calm and composed. "This is your captain, David Mills. We'll be heading east today with a projected flight time of just under 4 hours. Conditions look smooth across most of the route. Please sit back, relax, and we'll be on our way shortly." Eloise initiated the safety demonstration with the other crew. Her gestures were sharp, mechanical. She didn't make eye contact with the passengers, just moved through the script, pointing, demonstrating, instructing. Alana paid attention, mimicking the oxygen mask routine under her breath. Julian smiled at her earnestness. As the aircraft began taxiing toward the runway, Alana leaned her head against his shoulder. "You think this plane has Wi-Fi? Probably, but you've got your coloring book. Let's save the internet for after we land." She nodded, still staring out the window. Then came the hum, the engine's gentle roar, like a heartbeat rising. The acceleration pressed them gently into their seats. Alana squeezed Julian's hand with excitement. Takeoff still magic, no matter how many times you'd flown. The plane lifted, Denver fell away. The clouds swallowed the ground. Moments later, the seatbelt sign flicked off with a soft ding. Passengers stirred, retrieving headphones, adjusting pillows, flipping through seat-back magazines. A few attendants, including Connor, began preparing for beverage service. Julian unbuckled his blazer slightly and let himself exhale. He didn't expect perfection on this flight, just decency. Alana turned toward him. "Daddy. Remember when you said some people are carrying invisible backpacks?" He tilted his head. "I did. Why, I think the lady with the tight hair has one of those. Like a really heavy one." Julian looked at her, surprised by her perception, touched by her phrasing. "You might be right," he said quietly. "But even with heavy backpacks, we still have to be kind." Alana nodded. Then, after a pause, "So, do we have to be kind to people who aren't kind?" Julian smiled softly. "That's the hardest part. But yes, that's where it matters most." Alana leaned into him again, her gaze thoughtful now. The hum of the aircraft continued, but somewhere between the steady rhythm of flight and the warm conversation between father and daughter, a different current stirred beneath the surface, one that neither of them had yet felt fully. Kindness, after all, is not something we earn with our titles. It's something we choose moment by moment, row by row, person by person, and soon, someone would choose not to. The cabin had settled into that familiar lull somewhere between takeoff and the first beverage cart. Overhead bins were locked, tray tables folded, and passengers were either tapping at tablets or flipping through paperback novels with worn spines. A toddler 2 rows ahead fussed softly, but his mother, practiced and patient, gently shushed him with a pacifier and a lullaby. In row 18, Alana had pulled out her colored pencils and was sketching a cartoon plane wearing sunglasses and a smile. She titled it Captain Cool Wings in bold bubble letters. Julian watched her, one arm draped casually on the armrest, the other tucked across his lap with the small notepad he always carried. He wasn't writing much, just watching, thinking. He liked to observe things most CEOs rarely got to see: how long it took for someone to respond to a call button, how a passenger's tone shifted after being treated kindly versus curtly, whether the coffee tasted stale. The small things, he believed, were where companies earned their reputations. A light rattle approached from the rear galley, the familiar squeak and clatter of the beverage cart. Connor Diaz led the service, already smiling as he handed out drinks to passengers in row 15. A few aisles across, Eloise Granger rolled the second cart forward with her same mechanical precision. No smile, no eye contact, just efficient, stiff movements. The contrast was striking if you paid attention. Julian did. "Daddy," Alana said, nudging his elbow as she held up her ginger ale. "I think I spilled a little." Sure enough, the can teetered slightly on the tray table, a cold ring of liquid dripping down its side and pooling near her coloring book. "Oh, careful," Julian said softly. "Let's clean that up." He unbuckled, leaned forward, and reached up to the overhead bin for a tissue packet from his bag. The plane hit a mild pocket of turbulence, not much, just enough to cause a few heads to lift and a couple of hands to tighten around drink cups. Julian steadied himself as he retrieved the tissues, then sat back down. As he blotted the spill gently with the edge of a napkin, he heard a voice just beside him. "Sir, the seatbelt sign is still on. Please remain seated." It was Eloise. Julian looked up. Her face was unreadable, flat, rigid, and oddly confrontational. "I understand," he said, calmly. "My daughter spilled her drink. I was just getting tissues to keep it from dripping onto the floor." Eloise folded her arms. "Well, now you know for next time." Then she turned on her heel and pushed her cart forward. Julian blinked. There was no further explanation, no offer to help, not even acknowledgement of the child sitting beside him, who had frozen mid-coloring and now looked up with wide, uncertain eyes. "Did I do something wrong?" Alana whispered. Julian smiled gently and shook his head. "Not at all. Sweetheart, you're okay." She nodded slowly, but didn't return to her drawing. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she watched Eloise move on. A few minutes passed. The tension melted just a little as Connor arrived with the second cart. "Hey there," he said with warmth. "Would you like something to drink?" Julian smiled. "I think she's had her fill of ginger ale. Could she have a small cup of water?" "Please." Connor reached immediately into the bin, poured ice into a plastic cup, and filled it with water from a chilled bottle. "Here you go, Captain," he joked, handing it to Alana. She giggled and took it with both hands. Connor leaned closer to Julian and lowered his voice. "She's got the best seat in the house." Julian nodded, appreciative. "She does." Connor moved on, and Julian felt the air around them lighten. But just as Alana took a sip, a bit of turbulence rocked the aircraft again, sharper this time. Her cup tilted suddenly, splashing water across her tray table and onto her lap. "Oh no," she whispered, panicked. "It's okay. It's okay," Julian said gently, reaching again for the tissues he'd already been using. Alana dabbed at her pants. Her coloring book was now slightly damp on one corner. As Julian helped clean up, Eloise passed by again. He raised his hand, polite but direct. "Excuse me, may I get another cup of water for my daughter?" Eloise stopped, looked at the tray, then down at Alana. Her eyes lingered a fraction too long. She tilted her head slightly. "We don't have any more water available right now. You'll need to wait." Julian blinked. "I'm sorry, are you out entirely?" She didn't answer the question directly. Instead, she offered a cool reply. "I'll check the rear galley later." Then she continued down the aisle without waiting for a response. Julian stared after her, caught off guard. The cart, clearly visible beside her, had multiple sealed water bottles in plain sight. He wasn't imagining this. It wasn't the denial that struck hardest, it was the look in her eyes. Not forgetfulness, not haste, but something closer to indifference, even subtle disdain. Julian turned to Alana, who sat quietly now, hands in her lap. "I'll get you some in a bit," he said softly. "Don't worry." She nodded but didn't meet his eyes. He could feel the shift in her mood. A child's spirit dims quickly when the world feels unjust, and they can't explain why. Julian leaned back in his seat, folded his hands, and looked out the window, though there was nothing to see but cloud cover. He didn't like jumping to conclusions, but he knew what he saw, and, more importantly, what he felt. This wasn't about water anymore. It never was. For a while, silence hung around row 18 like fog. The hum of the engines filled the space where conversation usually lived. Julian glanced at Alana. Her coloring book remained open, but her hand lay idle, the red pencil still pinched gently between her fingers. Across the aisle, a flight attendant handed a young white boy in row 17 a full bottle of water with a cheerful smile. His mother laughed softly, thanking the crew member and unwrapping a snack from her purse. Julian watched quietly, thoughtfully. He wasn't angry, not yet, but he was noticing. All of it. Alana finally spoke. "Daddy, if I said something wrong, I didn't mean to." Julian turned to her. Her voice was so soft, like she was trying not to disturb the world any more than she already had. "You didn't say anything wrong," he said gently, "and you didn't do anything wrong." She looked unconvinced. Her fingers began to trace invisible patterns into the hem of her shirt. "Then why doesn't she like me?" Julian inhaled slowly, holding the breath for a second before speaking. "Some people carry hurt around in ways they don't even realize. Sometimes that hurt shows up as unkindness. It's not about you. It's about something in them." Alana tilted her head. "But isn't being nice just easy? It should be," Julian said. "But for some, it's the hardest thing in the world." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small sealed pack of wet wipes. Carefully, he cleaned her tray table and wiped down the damp corners of her coloring book. Then, without a word, he slipped a small notebook into the seat back pocket and began jotting notes. Flight 1A4, Eloise Granger, 10:14 a.m. Water refusal, second request. He didn't plan to report it yet, but he needed to keep a record. He always did. A moment later, A soft voice came from behind. "Excuse me." Julian turned. An older woman sat in row 19C. She had warm brown skin and wore a navy sari with gold trim. Her eyes were kind, her voice calm but firm. "I couldn't help overhearing," she said, holding out a small, unopened bottle of water. "If she's still thirsty, please take this." Julian shook his head politely. "That's very kind, ma'am, but I don't want you to go without." The woman smiled. "I always bring two. It's a habit from Mumbai. Please." He accepted it with a nod. "Thank you. Truly." Alana unscrewed the cap carefully and drank. She paused midway and looked toward the woman. "Thank you," she said softly. "You're welcome, little one," the woman replied. Julian turned back toward the window. That small act of kindness, one stranger seeing another in pain and stepping forward, meant more than the bottle of water ever could. Yet the tension simmered beneath his skin. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an oversight. He had seen it before, covert, practiced, institutionalized, not loud, not overt, just subtle enough to be deniable, but obvious enough to be felt in your bones. He glanced toward the front of the cabin. Eloise stood near the galley, arms crossed, chatting with another crew member. Her laugh didn't match the person Julian had met at boarding. Maybe this wasn't personal, but it was most certainly wrong. A few rows up, a teenage boy had also noticed the earlier interaction. He turned and looked toward Julian, then glanced at Eloise. His earbuds dangled from his hoodie. Music paused. He didn't say anything, but the way he looked made it clear he saw it, too. Julian closed his notebook, slid it back into the seat back, and sat up straighter. He could remain silent, or he could start observing out loud. Later, as Connor rolled by with snack service, he paused again at row 18. "Can I offer you anything pretzels trail mix apple crisps?" Julian glanced at Alana. "What do you think, apple crisps?" she said softly. Connor reached for a bag, but paused. "Did you ever get that water?" By the way, Julian hesitated, "not from who we asked." Connor frowned slightly, reading between the lines. "I'm sorry to hear that." "No need to apologize," Julian said. "You've been kind." Connor nodded, handed them the snacks, and moved along, but the glance he gave Eloise at the galley door was not subtle. Julian saw it, and so did Eloise. She returned to the aisle moments later. Without a word, she skipped row 18 entirely. Julian didn't react, didn't shift. He only sat calmly, noting her decision. Eloise's avoidance was loud, and everyone around was starting to hear it. The plane soared somewhere above Missouri, and while the weather outside remained smooth and serene, the atmosphere inside the cabin of Crescent Pacific Flight 184 was growing increasingly strained. Julian Everett stared straight ahead, his hands folded neatly in his lap. The tension in his shoulders held tightly like a string pulled taut. Alana had stopped coloring. Her eyes occasionally flicked to the aisle, then back to her apple crisps, which she had barely touched. It wasn't just the denial of water now. It was the way Eloise Granger hadn't made eye contact. The way she deliberately skipped their row during snack service, as if Alana had become invisible, as if Julian, a paying passenger, was no longer entitled to even basic acknowledgement. Julian didn't need confrontation to validate the truth. He believed in pattern recognition, and what he was seeing now wasn't isolated. It was a pattern he had witnessed in boardrooms, lounges, terminals, and now, at 30,000 feet, directed at his daughter. He breathed deeply through his nose, grounding himself. Reacting in anger wouldn't teach Alana strength, but ignoring it completely, that wouldn't teach her dignity either. Across the aisle, the teenage boy who'd been watching earlier leaned toward Julian and whispered, "She's doing it on purpose. Man." Julian glanced sideways. "I saw her give that guy a bottle of water, like 5 minutes after telling you there was none." Julian offered a faint smile. "I noticed." The boy shook his head and leaned back, muttering something beneath his breath that Julian couldn't quite catch, but the sentiment was clear. "This isn't right." Just then, Connor Diaz returned up the aisle, his pace slower now, his eyes scanning. He reached row 18 and bent down discreetly. "I just want to say," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "I've noticed, too. I'm sorry." Julian looked at him. "You have nothing to apologize for?" Connor looked uneasy. "Eloise, she's been with the airline a long time. Seniority. But that doesn't excuse anything. I wish I could step in more directly." But Julian raised a hand gently. "Connor, you've already done more than enough just by being kind." Connor gave a small, appreciative nod, then stood. "If you need anything at all, just ring the bell." "For anything." Julian nodded. "Thank you." As Connor walked away, Eloise emerged from the galley with a refreshed clipboard and a half-eaten granola bar in her hand. She moved with the sharp confidence of someone who believed she was in control of the space. She glanced toward Julian and Alana's row and looked away just as quickly. That was when Mrs. Kapoor, the older woman from row 19, pressed the call button above her seat. The chime was soft but sharp enough to snap Eloise's attention. She turned and marched over briskly. "Yes, ma'am," she asked, her voice clipped and professional. "I'd like to speak with the lead flight attendant." "Please," Mrs. Kapoor said. "I am the lead flight attendant." Eloise replied. "I see," Mrs. Kapoor said, sitting straighter. "Then I'm requesting to speak with the captain." Eloise blinked, taken aback. "May I ask why?" "You may," Mrs. Kapoor said evenly. "I've been flying for over 40 years. I've never witnessed a child treated with such disregard. I think the captain should be made aware." Eloise's lips tightened. She seemed unsure whether to threaten or retreat. Before she could choose, a passenger 2 rows ahead, a man in business attire with a silver beard, turned and added, "She's not wrong. I've been watching, too. This is not acceptable service." A younger woman with headphones still resting around her neck joined in. "Yeah, it's not even subtle. She's been ignoring them the whole flight." Eloise looked stunned. The tide was turning. For a brief moment, she looked like a person standing alone on a crumbling ledge. "I would advise all passengers to remain calm," she said, her voice growing defensive. "We're trained professionals. If you have concerns, you can submit them after landing through the appropriate channels. Or," Julian said softly, "we could begin addressing them now respectfully." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. He didn't stand. He didn't raise his tone. But in that instant, something shifted in the air, a recalibration of authority. Eloise glared at him. "Sir, I'll thank you not to challenge the crew mid-flight." "I'm not challenging anyone," Julian replied calmly. "I'm protecting my daughter's right to be treated with basic decency." The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Alana stared at her father, eyes wide, not afraid, but in awe. Eloise muttered something under her breath, then turned sharply and stomped back toward the galley. As she disappeared, murmurs rippled through the rows. That was unbelievable. She really thinks nobody notices. Good for him. Julian turned to Alana and placed a steady hand on her back. "See," he said gently. "Sometimes silence isn't golden. It just lets the wrong things grow louder." Alana didn't say anything right away. Then, slowly, she leaned her head against his arm. "I feel a little better," she whispered. He smiled down at her. "So do I." The plane sailed smoothly across the country. But inside the cabin of Crescent Pacific Flight 184, the atmosphere was taut. Conversations were quieter now. Whispers filled the space where small talk had once lived. Passengers exchanged glances across aisles, the way people do when they realize something bigger is unfolding in their midst, not a spectacle, but a reckoning. Julian Everett remained composed. Externally, he looked as calm as he had the moment he boarded. But internally, he was walking a tightrope between the values he preached as a leader and the fatherly fire rising in his chest. He had been underestimated before. He'd been dismissed. But watching his daughter become the target of that kind of cold neglect, it was a different storm entirely. Alana sat beside him, her legs curled up in the seat now, hands clasped in her lap. She hadn't said much since Eloise stormed away. There was relief in her body, but also that familiar ache children carry after witnessing something unfair they don't yet fully understand. Julian reached over and gently took her hand in his. "You okay, sweetheart?" She nodded. "Yeah, but she's still up there. What if she comes back mad?" Julian offered her a steady look. "If she does, she won't be able to stay mad long. You've got a whole row of people who won't let that happen again." Alana gave a small smile and leaned into his shoulder. Then, as if summoned, Eloise Granger returned. She walked down the aisle briskly, clipboard in hand. This time, her expression had changed. The mask had cracked slightly, and behind it was something new, a defensive edge. She passed Connor near row 14 and exchanged a few hushed words. He looked taken aback, but nodded stiffly and stepped aside, his posture suddenly guarded. Eloise stopped at row 18. Her voice was carefully pitched to sound neutral, but it landed like a challenge. "Can I get you something, sir?" she asked Julian, emphasizing the word sir in a tone that barely disguised its bitterness. Julian looked up, his face unreadable. "Yes, my daughter would like apple juice, if that's available." Eloise blinked. Her gaze flicked quickly to Alana, then back to Julian. "We're out of apple juice," she said flatly. Before Julian could respond, the teenage boy across the aisle pointed toward the beverage cart Connor had left near row 17. "Actually, I think there's apple juice right there," he said, his voice cutting through the moment with precise clarity. Eloise didn't look. Julian turned slightly and could see the unmistakable orange gold of several juice cartons stacked neatly. "I see at least 3, Julian said quietly. Eloise's jaw twitched. "We have procedures, sir. We can't mix items from different carts. That's not how it works." Another voice chimed in from behind the older man with the silver beard. "That's not true," he said. "I fly Crescent Pacific monthly. I've watched flight attendants walk between carts when something runs out. It's standard." Eloise's expression faltered. Her eyes darted, hunting for a lifeline that wasn't there. Connor Diaz, standing nearby, looked frozen. Julian turned to him gently. "Connor, could you please clarify the policy?" Connor hesitated, then, with the weight of the entire aisle watching, he spoke clearly. There's no official restriction on sharing supplies between carts. Sir, we're encouraged to be flexible to meet passenger needs. Eloise's face darkened. She turned back to Julian, her voice sharp. I'm sorry if we're not meeting your lofty expectations, she said, lips curling slightly at the word lofty. But we're doing our best. Now the murmurs returned, louder this time. Lofty? Really? She's talking to him like he's beneath her. This is outrageous. Julian didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. He simply leaned forward and spoke with the same calm authority that had built companies, rebuilt departments, and led thousands of employees. My expectations, he said slowly, are that any child, mine or anyone's, is treated with respect. A cup of apple juice is not a luxury item. It's a basic request. What's not meeting expectations is the lack of empathy, the inconsistent service, and the tone. Eloise swallowed. Her hands were rigid at her sides. I'm handling row 18, she said stiffly. It's under control. Then came the sound, a soft ding. Another call button had been pressed. It was Mrs. Kapoor again. Eloise turned sharply. Yes, she asked, clearly strained. Mrs. Kapoor didn't flinch. I'd like a formal complaint form, please. In paper, now. Eloise scoffed audibly. Then, from several rows back, the voice of a young woman rang out. I'd like one, too. Then a third passenger, and a fourth. In a span of 30 seconds, more than 5 passengers had asked in unison to file complaints. Eloise stood paralyzed. The cabin now no longer a backdrop to her performance, but an audience unwilling to applaud. Julian looked at her one last time and said, not unkindly, perhaps it's time someone else handled row 18. Eloise turned on her heel and marched toward the front. This time, the silence behind her was deafening, but it didn't belong to her anymore. The tension lingered like static in the air, buzzing beneath every polite whisper and exchanged glance. Crescent Pacific Flight 184 had become something else entirely, no longer just a route between Denver and Boston, but a vessel carrying something heavier than luggage truth and the uneasy weight of accountability. Eloise Granger hadn't been seen in nearly 10 minutes. She had vanished into the front galley after the wave of complaint requests, leaving behind a trail of silence and unanswered questions. But that silence wasn't peace. It was the eye of a gathering storm. Julian sat in his seat, not triumphant, not angry, just steady, calm. His daughter's small hand was still in his, and that was what grounded him more than anything else. He hadn't set out to make a scene. In fact, he had tried very intentionally to avoid one. But sometimes, the moment makes the choice for you. Connor Diaz returned to row 18 discreetly, crouching slightly to speak without being overheard. Sir, he said in a whisper, I just want you to know, the captain is aware. One of the other crew members radioed in after the complaint forms were requested. Julian arched a brow, and Connor hesitated. He asked for us to remain professional and de-escalate. He'll file a report after landing, but he's leaving it to the cabin crew for now. Julian nodded slowly. That was protocol. Still, it left a bitter taste. She's still in charge of this flight, Connor added reluctantly. But off the record, many of us are uncomfortable with what's happened. Julian studied him. Thank you for being honest. Connor looked embarrassed. I wish I'd spoken up sooner. You spoke when it mattered. Connor offered a tight smile, then moved on. Just as Julian turned to check on Alana, Eloise reappeared. She stood tall, arms behind her back, expression pulled so tight it could snap. Her composure had returned, but it was forced, the way glass reforms after it's been shattered and glued back together. "Sir," she said to Julian, her voice brittle, "I'd like to offer you and your daughter a beverage. Your choice." Julian blinked slowly, as if trying to decide whether this was an olive branch or a trap. "I thought there wasn't any apple juice left," he said gently. Eloise didn't respond to the challenge. "We've found some," she said, before Julian could answer. "Mrs." Kapoor's voice rose from behind him, calm but firm. "Why now?" Eloise turned. "I'm sorry, Mrs." Kapoor sat with her hands folded across her sari. "Why are you offering it now, after ignoring the girl, after denying her twice? Why now?" A younger man 2 rows up added, "Yeah, feels a little too convenient." Eloise's mask cracked again just slightly. "I'm trying to resolve the situation," she said, voice clipped. Julian exhaled slowly and glanced down at Alana. "Would you like some apple juice, sweetheart?" Alana nodded, just a little. Julian turned back to Eloise. "Then we'll accept it." Eloise disappeared for a moment and returned with the small carton and a plastic cup. She handed it to Alana without a word. Alana said, "Thank you," softly. Eloise didn't respond. "Would you like anything?" "Sir?" she asked Julian flatly. "No," he replied, "but I would like to know if you're okay." That stopped her. "I beg your pardon. You seem tired," Julian said evenly. "Frustrated, distracted. I've worked in enough environments to know when someone's carrying something heavy." Eloise bristled. "I'm perfectly capable of handling my duties. I'm not questioning your capability," he said, "but I'm questioning the spirit in which those duties are carried out." She opened her mouth, then closed it. A beat passed. Then she turned without another word and walked back toward the galley. After she left, the man across the aisle leaned toward Julian. "Sir," he said, "I'm not trying to be nosy, but are you a lawyer or someone in government?" Julian chuckled under his breath. "Something like that." The man smiled. "Well, you're better spoken than most I've seen in those seats. Whatever you do, you handled that with grace." Julian gave a nod of thanks, but said nothing else. He didn't need anyone to know who he was, not yet, but he was making notes in his mind now, clicking into a different mode. CEO, architect, reformer, father. These identities rarely converged in public, but now they were aligning with clarity. His quiet decision to fly economy that day had become something more than routine. It was now a case study in culture, service, and accountability. And it wasn't over yet. As the aircraft continued eastward, the captain announced that they would begin their descent into Boston in just under an hour. Julian leaned back, watching the cabin return to its former rhythm, though not entirely. The energy had changed. Passengers were still watchful, still alert. But in row 18, Alana smiled again, sipping her juice, finally relaxed. Julian turned toward the window and thought quietly, "Sometimes it takes just one unkind moment to test everything you believe about justice. And sometimes it takes a cabin full of strangers to remind you that you're not alone in that belief." The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've begun our initial descent into Boston Logan International. Weather on the ground is clear and cool, ideal for landing. We'll be on the ground in approximately 25 minutes. Please fasten your seatbelts and ensure all carry-on items are stowed securely." Chimes followed. Passengers straightened in their seats. Some adjusted window shades, others plugged in earbuds for one last song before touchdown. Julian Everett buckled his seatbelt again and looked over at Alana, who was gazing out the window, her now empty juice cup resting securely in the holder. "You excited to see Boston again?" he asked softly. She nodded. "Will we go to the museum again, with the glass elevators?" "Definitely," he said. "We'll even ride the tall one twice." She smiled, but then her expression changed, hesitant. "Is that lady going to get in trouble?" Julian exhaled through his nose, choosing his words carefully. "That's not for us to decide. But when someone causes harm, especially over and over, it's important someone notices. Like you." "No," he said. "Like everyone on this plane. The passengers who spoke up, Connor, Mrs. Kapoor, even the ones who just stayed silent but watched, they matter too." Alana looked down, thinking, "If she's in trouble, I hope she learns something." Julian smiled gently. "So do I." Just then, Connor Diaz returned to row 18 again, crouching slightly to speak discreetly. "We'll be on the ground soon. I just wanted to say thank you again. I don't know what might come of this, but we've needed someone like you on this plane for a long time." Julian raised an eyebrow. "Someone like me. Someone who says what the rest of us feel." Connor replied, with grace, without yelling, just truth. Julian held his gaze. Sometimes the truth needs an echo. Connor gave a tight nod, then stood. If you're ever in Boston again, and you need help with anything, even off the clock." Julian chuckled. "Noted." He appreciated Connor's sincerity, but also saw the guilt in his eyes, the weight of being a good person in a broken system. It was something Julian had seen in many employees over the years, people who wanted to do more, but were boxed in by policies, hierarchy, or fear of retaliation. He made a mental note Connor was a keeper. Meanwhile, Eloise Granger hadn't reappeared, not since offering the juice. She was likely strapped into her jump seat now, tucked behind the galley curtain, waiting for the landing to deliver her safely out of this uncomfortable chapter. And Julian, he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. The landing gear lowered with a heavy thunk. Alana leaned forward, pressing her nose against the window as the Boston skyline emerged beneath them, bridges like arms stretched across rivers. Rooftops clustered like a patchwork quilt, and tiny yellow taxis zipping below like ants. Then the touch. A smooth glide, a brief bounce. The wheels kissed the runway with the grace of a practiced hand. Applause broke out across the cabin. Not all flights earned that, only the ones where people felt like they'd survived something together. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Julian felt the weight in his chest begin to shift, not disappear, but shift. He had kept his identity quiet, not to deceive, but to witness without distortion. Still, the time for silence was ending. After the seatbelt sign flicked off, people rose and reached for bags. Voices rose again, louder, freer. But in row 18, Julian remained seated, one hand resting lightly on Alana's back as she gathered her backpack. He wasn't rushing. He was waiting. Connor appeared first. "Sir, we've notified ground operations. I believe someone will be meeting you at the jet bridge." Julian gave a small nod. "Will you be all right?" Connor asked quietly. Julian smiled. "I've got everything I need." He stood slowly, motioned for Alana to go ahead, and they joined the back of the line, shuffling toward the exit. As they neared the front, Eloise was there, posture stiff, arms crossed behind her back. She avoided eye contact again, though this time it looked more like shame than stubbornness. Julian didn't speak. He simply gave her a calm, measured look, not angry, not bitter, just human. Alana, to everyone's surprise, turned and said softly, "I hope you have a better day next time." Eloise blinked. She didn't answer. Julian placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder and guided her gently onto the jet bridge. Waiting just past the gate was a woman in a navy blazer and gold badge, Operations Director Renee Thomas. She looked mid-40s, sharp but open-faced. She recognized Julian instantly and straightened. "Mr. Everett," she said, "I've reserved a conference room for a private debrief. If you're ready." Julian gave a single nod. As they walked down the hallway toward the airline's operations suite, Alana whispered, "Are we in trouble?" Julian smiled and shook his head. Not even close. The conference room smelled like paper and lemon-scented cleaner. Clean, sterile, quiet. A small table sat in the center, flanked by 3 chairs. On it, a pitcher of water, 2 glasses, and a packet of complaint forms lay waiting, as if the room already knew what it was built for. Julian Everett stepped inside with Alana by his side. Renee Thomas, Crescent Pacific's Director of Operations, motioned for him to take a seat. She carried a tablet and wore the kind of expression that blended professional alertness with the nervous curiosity of someone who just realized they might be standing in front of their boss's boss. Julian sat down slowly. He looked at the glass of water in front of Alana. "Is this okay for her to drink?" he asked softly. Renee blinked. "Yes, of course. Good," Julian replied. "Because apparently that's no longer a guarantee on our flights." She gave a slow nod, absorbing the implication. "Mr. Everett, may I just say if I'd known you were on board," he raised a hand gently. "I didn't want anyone to know. That was the point." She paused. "You were conducting a covert inspection." Julian exhaled. "I was flying with my daughter." Silence stretched between them. Then, "But yes," he added, "I was also observing that flight, that crew, our brand, our culture." Renee set her tablet down, her back straightening. "Then I need to start by apologizing." He gave a brief nod. "Start there, yes. But don't end there." Alana glanced up at her father. "Can I draw while you talk?" He smiled. "Of course." She pulled her coloring book from her backpack and slid into quiet focus, her crayons now softly scratching against the page. Renee opened a folder. "I've already reviewed the initial incident report. Several passengers submitted complaints mid-flight. The first came from a Mrs. Kapoor. The others followed quickly after. She's a force of nature," Julian said with a half-smile. "There's also a note from Connor Diaz. He mentioned you directly. Said you were calm, clear, but firm. He was professional." Julian said, "He made a difference." Renee nodded and made a note. "And Eloise Granger." Julian took a breath. Her tone was dismissive. Her service was selective. And her disregard for my daughter was not only unprofessional, it was deliberate. She made eye contact with me once, only once. Every other interaction was a decision not to engage, not to see us, and your daughter was denied basic service. Twice, he said, water, then juice. Both requests were ignored or lied about. I watched other passengers, those who didn't look like us, receive the same items without delay. Renee sat very still. "I've flown a lot of miles," Julian continued. "I've led teams through product recalls, bankruptcies, public scandals, but I've never had to explain to my 8-year-old daughter why someone might see her and decide she doesn't deserve kindness." Renee's eyes dropped. She asked me, "Did I do something wrong?" Alana looked up at that. "I thought I broke a rule or something." Julian gently touched her hand. Renee's voice cracked slightly. "I'm so sorry." Julian gave her a look that was neither cruel nor forgiving, just clear. "I don't need you to be sorry. I need the company to be different." Renee nodded. "There will be a full internal investigation, a review board. Eloise will be placed on immediate administrative leave." Julian raised an eyebrow. "Effective immediately." "Yes." "Good," he said. "Then I'll give you my full cooperation." He opened his notebook and began flipping through the pages he'd filled during the flight. Notes, times, names, passenger interactions, all of it. Renee watched him, astonished. "You were documenting the entire time?" Julian nodded. "Every flight tells a story. I wanted this one to end with accountability." After the formal debrief concluded, Renee stood and extended her hand. "Mr. Everett, thank you for your time, your patience, and your clarity." He shook her hand. "I expect updates," he said. "You'll get them." She replied. Then she turned to Alana. "And thank you, Alana. You were very brave today." Alana smiled softly. "I just wanted some juice." They left the room, walking past uniformed staff who smiled nervously, not quite sure who Julian was, but aware that something important had just happened. Outside in the car that was waiting to take them to their hotel, Alana climbed into the back seat, her coloring book resting on her lap. "Daddy." "Yes." "Do you think she hates us?" Julian paused. Then he turned in his seat to face her. "No, sweetie. I think she doesn't know how to see us." Alana frowned. "You mean she looked but didn't really look?" "That's exactly what I mean." She looked out the window. "I hope someday she sees better." Julian stared at her for a long moment, pride rising in his chest like a slow flame. "So do I." A cold breeze drifted off the Charles River as Julian Everett stood near the window of their hotel suite, looking down at the busy streets of Boston. The lights shimmered off car roofs, and a steady rhythm pulsed from the city below: commuters, delivery vans, pedestrians crossing with coffee cups in hand. Life moved on. Behind him, Alana was curled up under a blanket, watching cartoons on low volume, her braids freshly combed, a hint of cocoa butter scent still lingering in the air. She'd said she wanted to watch something silly, something where no one was mean, and everyone just danced or fell into pies. Julian couldn't blame her. His phone vibrated on the table, a message from Renee Tama. "Investigation has begun. Eloise Granger formally placed on leave. We are reaching out to passengers who submitted complaints. More updates to follow." Julian typed a short reply. "Thank you. I trust you'll act with integrity." Then he closed his phone and exhaled. He hadn't told Alana everything about who he was to the company, about the decisions he was now quietly influencing. He wanted to protect her sense of normal. She was 8. She shouldn't have to carry all that weight, but someday. He'd tell her how she helped change a piece of an industry by just existing, and expecting to be treated with respect. The next morning, over hotel waffles and orange juice, Julian received an email from the board chair of Crescent Pacific Airlines. "Julian, we've reviewed the incident reports and your notes. What happened is inexcusable. We've begun a task force to reevaluate onboard service training. I know you've always believed leadership starts in the aisles. Your presence on board reminded us why. Thank you for not just noticing, but responding with clarity. We'd like your input as we build a new model." Julian sipped his coffee, thinking. The model, he'd spoken about it years ago at a leadership retreat, the idea that small injustices, left unchecked, accumulate into systems, and that those systems, if not reformed with intention, would harden into culture. He never imagined his own daughter would be the catalyst for confronting it so publicly. That evening, as they waited in the hotel lobby for a driver to take them to dinner, a young flight attendant approached. "Mr. Everett?" she asked. Cautious. Julian turned. "I just wanted to say, thank you," the woman said. "We've all heard what happened. People talk in the crew lounges. You stood up in a way that gave some of us hope." He nodded. "That shouldn't take heroism. It should be policy." She smiled. "Well, maybe now it will be." A few days later, back in Los Angeles, Julian stepped into the glass and wood boardroom at Crescent Pacific headquarters. The room was quieter than usual. He looked across the long table where executives and department heads sat with tablets and nervous anticipation. Renee was there. So was the CEO, whom Julian had helped hire. Today, Julian was stepping into his role not just as majority shareholder, but as conscience. "Let's begin," he said. The boardroom was silent as Julian Everett stood at the head of the long table. The morning sun glinted off the high-rise windows behind him, casting long shadows across polished wood and anxious faces. No one spoke. They were used to Julian as a strategic investor, a mentor, a calm visionary. But the man who stood before them now was no longer speaking from slides or forecasts. He was speaking from lived experience and from the seat of 18B, where justice had briefly gone missing. Julian adjusted his cuffs, then began. "I didn't come here to shame anyone," he said evenly. "But I also didn't come here to comfort the comfortable. What happened on Flight 184 wasn't just an individual failure, it was a cultural one." He paused. It's easy to blame one person, to isolate Eloise Granger as the problem. But the truth is, she acted in an environment that permitted her attitude to grow unchecked. She operated within a system that gave her seniority, but never demanded introspection. Around the table, department heads shifted, some nodded, some scribbled notes, others stared, faces tight with the awareness that this moment wasn't just for optics, it was a reckoning. I've reviewed our training manuals. The words empathy and equity appear a grand total of twice, once in onboarding, once in a buried HR memo. That's not a culture, that's a checkbox. He looked around the table, meeting each set of eyes. We don't need Band-Aids, we need rewiring. Renee Thomas cleared her throat. "What do you propose?" Julian didn't miss a beat. "We start by redefining service, not as task completion, but as human connection. Every flight crew member should be evaluated not only on efficiency, but on empathy. We implement bias training not annually, but quarterly, built into real scenarios, using our own data, our own failures." A younger executive at the far end leaned in. "You mean, turn Flight 184 into a case study, I mean." Julian replied, "We make it our turning point." Silence again, but now it held a pulse, something awakening. "I also want a mentorship program. Pair new crew members with our most emotionally intelligent staff, people like Connor Diaz, people who lead with kindness." Julian then turned and clicked a small remote. Behind him, a slide appeared. The new standard dignity at 35,000 feet. He continued, We launch an internal initiative, Dignity at 35,000 feet. Every employee, every position, from booking agents to baggage handlers. This isn't about punishment. It's about prevention, about protection, about pride in who we are not just as a company, but as people. One of the VPs spoke quietly. What about Granger Julian didn't answer immediately. She will go through the disciplinary review process. I don't believe in vendettas. I believe in consequences that teach. Another pause. Then Julian closed with what no one expected a story. When I was 10, a teacher skipped over me every time we read aloud in class. I used to wonder if my voice didn't matter. It took me years to realize it wasn't about my voice, it was about hers. He looked directly at the room. Let's make sure no child, no customer, ever has to question whether their voice matters again, not in our sky. And with that, he sat down. The room was quiet for another long breath. Then Renee spoke. We'll draft the implementation plan by Friday. Julian simply nodded. Later that evening, back at home, Julian stepped into Alana's bedroom. She was tucked beneath her comforter, her stuffed rabbit clutched in one arm. She looked up sleepily. "Did you fix it?" she asked. He smiled, sitting beside her. "Not all of it, but I started something." She nodded. "Did people listen?" He brushed a braid from her cheek. "They listened because of you." Alana smiled faintly and closed her eyes. Outside the window, a distant jet traced its arc across the sky, and for once, Julian believed that maybe, just maybe, the air up there was beginning to change. 3 months later, Crescent Pacific Airlines hosted its annual gala at the downtown Los Angeles Skyview Ballroom. The theme, Elevate Together. Golden chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the floor-to-ceiling windows reflected a sweeping view of the city, glowing under starlight. Uniformed staff mingled with executives, board members, pilots, and flight attendants. But this year, there was something different in the air, not just celebration, but sincerity. Everyone felt it. At the heart of it all stood Julian Everett, dressed in a tailored midnight blue suit. He wasn't hiding anymore. Tonight, the room knew exactly who he was, not just the airline's principal owner, but the man who had boarded Flight 184 with his daughter and walked off it, having quietly rewritten the course of company culture. On a small stage near the front of the ballroom, Renee Tama took the mic. "This year," she said, "we faced hard truths. We listened. We changed. Because one man didn't stay silent. And because one little girl expected nothing more than fairness, and nothing less than dignity." The audience turned as Julian rose and approached the stage, calm and composed. At the edge of the crowd, Alana stood beside a kind flight attendant holding her hand, Connor Diaz, now promoted to lead mentor in the airline's new empathy training initiative. Julian took the mic. The room quieted. "When we talk about flight," he began, "we talk about altitude, distance, speed, but we rarely talk about the air we create inside the cabin, the invisible atmosphere, tone, language, and respect. That, too, is part of flying." He paused, scanning the crowd. 3 months ago, I sat in row 18 and watched a system fail my daughter, but I also watched something else, a teenage passenger who spoke up, an older woman who pushed back, a crew member who leaned in, people who remembered what we sometimes forget, that dignity is a shared currency, and every time we offer it, we make each other richer. Scattered applause. Julian continued, his voice softer now. Alana didn't need anyone to move mountains that day. She just needed someone to hand her a cup of water. It was never about the drink. It was about being seen. He looked toward her now. She smiled, shy, proud, still holding Connor's hand. Tonight, I'm proud to say that we've begun implementing our new initiative, Dignity at 35,000 feet. We've launched crew mentorships, revised training protocols, and created new accountability pathways for every department. But more importantly, we've begun telling the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. Applause swelled. Julian closed with one final thought. We can't change what we refuse to see, and we can't lead if we only look up. Sometimes we need to look around seat by seat, row by row, and ask who here still feels invisible. He stepped back from the mic. This time, the applause was not polite. It was thunderous. Later that night, as the ballroom cleared out and the lights dimmed, Julian stood on the balcony with Alana. Below them, the city buzzed. Planes blinked in the distant sky, tracing quiet arcs toward LAX. Alana looked up at him. Was tonight your speech? He laughed softly. Yes, ma'am, that was the speech. Did it help? I think it did. She leaned her head against his side. Good. I'm glad. Also, she glanced up with a mischievous grin. Do we get cake now? Julian chuckled. Absolutely. He turned, guided her inside. The music picked up again, glasses clinked, and somewhere in the middle of the joyful noise, a future was being rewritten one passenger, one crew member, one moment of kindness at a time. At 35,000 feet, prejudice doesn't just float, it cuts, but so can kindness. And sometimes, the smallest voices, like a child quietly asking for juice, can echo loud enough to change the culture of an entire airline. Julian Everett didn't raise his voice. He didn't flash his title. He simply stood beside his daughter and chose to see what others ignored. And because of that, a system bent toward silence was forced to listen. Let this story be a reminder. Dignity isn't optional, and justice doesn't always shout it often speaks in the calm firmness of those who refuse to look away. To every passenger who's ever felt invisible, we see you, and to those who made others feel invisible. The sky is watching now. If this story touched you, stirred something in your heart, or made you think twice about how we treat one another in public spaces, please like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories that lift, challenge, and connect us all. We'll see you in the next flight. Stay kind, stay alert, stay human,